I never expected to become the talk of Oak Ridge Estates, but life has a funny way of thrusting you into the spotlight when you least expect it. My name is Jamie Thornton, and until 3 months ago I was just a 32-year-old history professor at the local university, living in a cramped apartment downtown and spending my weekends buried in archives. Then my grandmother passed away, leaving me her charming Victorian home on Maple Street. The house had always been special to me, a place of warm memories and Sunday dinners, but I had no idea how special it truly was. I wonder where you're reading this from. Drop a comment below and let me know if you've ever had an encounter with an HOA nightmare like mine. The morning that changed everything started like any other. I was sipping coffee on the porch, admiring the antique wrought iron fence that encircled the property, a beautiful piece of craftsmanship that had stood for over a century, its intricate designs telling stories of a bygone era. The fence needed some repairs, admittedly, with patches of rust and a slightly crooked gate, but its historical charm was undeniable, at least that's what I thought. The peaceful moment was shattered by the mechanical growl of heavy machinery. I sprinted to the front yard just in time to witness a bulldozer crashing through my fence, metal twisting and breaking under its merciless treads. Behind the destruction stood a woman in her 50s, impeccably dressed in a beige pantsuit, her blonde hair styled in that distinctive "Can I speak to your manager" cut. She was gesturing animatedly at the worker operating the bulldozer, pointing at different sections of my fence as if directing a symphony of destruction. "What the hell is going on here?" I shouted, my voice barely audible over the machinery. The woman turned to me with a look of mild annoyance, as if I was interrupting her morning coffee rather than watching her demolish my property. She signaled to the operator, who cut the engine, leaving an eerie silence punctuated only by the occasional clang of settling metal. "You must be the new owner," she said, extending a manicured hand that I pointedly ignored. "I'm Patricia Richardson, HOA president, but everyone calls me Pat." Her smile didn't reach her eyes, which remained cold and calculating as she assessed me from head to toe. "This fence violates at least 6 different HOA regulations. I've been sending notices for weeks." She produced a folder from her designer tote bag, flipping it open to reveal a series of official-looking letters, all returned unopened. "So, as per Section 12, Paragraph 4 of our bylaws, the HOA has the right to remedy violations at the homeowner's expense." My blood was boiling, but years of academic debates had taught me to control my temper. "I never received any notices," I said, forcing calm into my voice, "and I seriously doubt that demolishing historical property without proper authorization is legal, regardless of your bylaws." Pat's perfectly plucked eyebrows rose slightly, the only indication that my words had registered. "Historical property? This eyesore? Please." "The HOA has jurisdiction over exterior aesthetics, and this fence is bringing down property values across the neighborhood. We're doing you a favor, really. The removal fee will only be $3,200, plus the mandatory modern replacement. Approved designs are in our catalog." She handed me a glossy brochure featuring mass-produced fencing options that would look more at home in a sterile suburban development than around my Victorian masterpiece. As we argued, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered, watching the drama unfold with undisguised interest. Some nodded in agreement with Pat, while others looked uncomfortable but remained silent. I realized then that Pat ruled this neighborhood through a combination of intimidation and bureaucratic knowledge that few could challenge. "This isn't over," I promised, turning away to assess the damage. That's when I noticed something in the rubble. A small bronze plaque, dislodged from where it must have been partially hidden by overgrown ivy near the fence's foundation. Brushing away dirt and debris, I read the faded inscription. "Thornton House, National Heritage Registry, 47,209, 1872. I stared at it, understanding dawning slowly. My grandmother had never mentioned this, but then again she'd been fiercely private about family matters. I turned back to Pat, who was already walking away, victory assumed. "You might want to hold off on billing me," I called after her, "because I think you've just destroyed protected federal property." The plaque felt heavy in my hands, heavier than its physical weight warranted. It represented something powerful, something that might just be my salvation against the HOA tyrant who'd smashed through my fence, and I suspected the lives of many others in this community. Pat paused mid-stride, turning back with an expression of practiced condescension. "Nice try, Professor, even if that trinket were real, which I doubt. It doesn't supersede HOA regulations that you agreed to when you took ownership," she continued, walking, waving dismissively over her shoulder. "Invoice in the mail by Friday." But I barely heard her. My mind was racing, connections forming between my academic knowledge and this unexpected discovery. If the house truly was on the National Registry, it would change everything. As the neighbors dispersed and the bulldozer rumbled away, I stood amid the wreckage of my fence, a plan already taking shape. Pat Richardson had no idea who she was dealing with. Not just a quiet professor, but a Thornton whose family had apparently been important enough to make history. And history, as I taught my students every day, has a way of coming back to change the present. The local historical society was housed in a modest brick building downtown, its interior a labyrinth of filing cabinets and glass-encased artifacts. Martha Jenkins, the elderly curator with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetual dust smudge on her cardigan, lit up when I placed the plaque on her desk. "The Thornton House? Oh my, I haven't thought about that property in years. Your grandmother was very private about it, refused most of our requests for documentation or tour." Her fingers danced across her keyboard with surprising agility for someone her age, and soon her monitor displayed scans of yellowed documents. "Here we are. Registered in 1979 after extensive research, proved it was the site of the secret negotiations between Union and Confederate representatives in 1865. Unofficial talks that some historians believe laid groundwork for the official surrender terms." Martha's eyes gleamed with excitement. "The house's original owner, Jonathan Thornton, your great-great-great-grandfather, I presume, was a diplomat who offered his home as neutral territory. The fence you mentioned was specially commissioned afterward, with symbols representing reunification hidden in its ironwork." I felt a strange mixture of pride and anger. Pride in my family's previously unknown contribution to history, and anger that Pat Richardson had so casually destroyed a piece of it. Martha continued pulling up documents, each one strengthening my case. "The National Heritage designation means your property has significant protections. No homeowners association can override federal historic preservation laws." She scribbled a name and number on a notepad. "Call Eleanor Michaels. She's an attorney specializing in historical preservation law. And here," she handed me a business card with the Department of Interior logo, "Dr. William Chen is our regional preservation officer. He'll want to know about this immediately." As I gathered the papers Martha had printed for me, she placed a gentle hand on my arm. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman who understood the value of preserving history, even if she preferred to do it quietly. Don't let anyone destroy what she protected for so long." Dr. Chen agreed to meet me at the house the following day. He arrived precisely at 9, a meticulous man in his 60s with a clipboard and measuring tape, his government-issued SUV parked at the curb. "This is unconscionable," he muttered, photographing the destroyed fence from multiple angles. "Completely illegal demolition of a Grade 2 historically significant structure." He paced the perimeter, making notes and occasionally shaking his head in disbelief. "The HOA president did this without permits? Without consulting the preservation office?" I nodded, watching him document the damage with professional precision. "She'll claim she sent notices," I said, "but I never received any. I've only owned the house for 3 months." Dr. Chen glanced up from his clipboard. "It wouldn't matter if she sent 100 notices. This property is clearly listed in the Federal Registry. Even with owner consent, any modifications require approval from our office and must be performed by certified historical restoration specialists." As Dr. Chen continued his assessment, a sleek black BMW pulled up behind his government vehicle. A woman in her 40s emerged, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit that screamed successful attorney. "Eleanor Michaels," she said, striding toward us with an outstretched hand. Martha filled me in. "This is a slam-dunk case if I've ever seen one." The three of us moved to my porch, where I served coffee in my grandmother's antique cups, while Eleanor outlined our strategy. First, we file for an emergency injunction to prevent any further improvements the HOA might have planned. Then we pursue damages. Not just for the fence replacement with historically accurate materials and craftsmanship, but punitive damages for willful destruction of protected property. She tapped her tablet, bringing up relevant precedents. In Miller v. Lakeside Community Association, the court awarded triple damages when the HOA removed historically protected landscaping. And in the Jameson case, the HOA president was personally held liable when she acted without board approval. Dr. Chen nodded approvingly. The department will file separate charges for violations of the National Historic Preservation Act. That carries potential federal penalties. He handed me his business card. "I'll expedite the paperwork. In the meantime, document everything and don't let anyone touch what remains of the fence." As they prepared to leave, a now familiar beige pantsuit appeared at the edge of my property. Pat Richardson stood with arms crossed, watching our meeting with obvious suspicion. Eleanor noticed her too and smiled thinly. "Perfect timing. Mind if I have a word with your HOA president?" Without waiting for my response, she strode toward Pat, her heels clicking purposefully on the walkway. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I saw Pat's expression shift from smugness to concern, then to poorly concealed alarm. By the time Eleanor returned, Pat had retreated to her car. "I served her notice of our intent to file for injunctive relief," Eleanor explained, "and I may have mentioned the potential for personal liability in the six-figure range." She smiled, satisfaction evident in her expression. She seemed quite eager to discuss the matter with the HOA board. When they had both gone, I stood on my porch, surveying the damaged property with new eyes. This wasn't just my inheritance anymore. It was a piece of American history that had been entrusted to my care. Pat had awakened something in me, a determination to protect this legacy and to ensure that no HOA tyrant could bully their way through this neighborhood again. I spent the evening poring over the documents Martha had provided, learning more about my family's connection to this house and its significance. By morning, I had a plan that went beyond merely restoring my fence. If Pat Richardson wanted a war, I would give her one. Fought with historical documents, legal precedents, and community activism, the quiet professor was ready to become a preservationist warrior. The emergency HOA board meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening in the community clubhouse, a modern building with uncomfortable chairs and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. I arrived early with Eleanor, Dr. Chen, and a stack of documentation thick enough to stop a bullet. The room filled quickly, neighbors curious about the sudden meeting and the rumors that had already begun circulating. Pat sat at the head table with 6 other board members, her expression carefully neutral, though I noticed her fingers drumming nervously on her leather portfolio. At precisely 7 o'clock, she called the meeting to order. "We're here to address concerns about recent enforcement actions taken at 1872 Maple Street," she began, her voice steady. "The homeowner has raised certain historical considerations that require board review." Eleanor and I exchanged glances. This measured approach was clearly damage control after our confrontation. When it was my turn to speak, I approached the podium with my grandmother's leather-bound family Bible, opening it to reveal pressed flowers and handwritten notes in the margins. "My family has lived in the Thornton house for 6 generations," I began, deliberately using the historical name to establish its significance. "During the Civil War, my great-great-grandfather hosted secret diplomatic meetings that helped heal our divided nation. The fence that was destroyed yesterday wasn't just an old iron barrier. It was commissioned specifically to commemorate those meetings, with symbols of reunification forged into its design." I placed photographs on the projector showing close-ups of the intricate metalwork that many neighbors had likely never noticed. In 1979, the property was added to the National Historic Registry, providing federal protections that supersede any homeowners association regulations. A murmur ran through the audience as I continued. I understand the importance of maintaining neighborhood standards, but I also believe that preserving our shared history enriches our community rather than diminishes it. I gestured to Dr. Chen, who stood and introduced himself, his government credentials lending weight to our case. The Department of Interior considers the unauthorized destruction of this fence a serious violation of federal preservation laws, he stated, his voice matter-of-fact. The penalties can include fines up to $100,000 and potential criminal charges for willful destruction. Another murmur, louder this time. Eleanor followed with a crisp legal explanation of the HOA's liability, carefully noting that board members who hadn't authorized the action might not be personally liable. A subtle suggestion that distancing themselves from Pat's unilateral decision would be in their best interest. Pat's composure cracked slightly as she realized her position was weakening. The HOA has always had final say over exterior appearances, she insisted, shuffling through her documents. All homeowners signed agreements acknowledging our authority. A board member, Frank Delgado, who owned the colonial-style home on Elm Street, cleared his throat. Did we vote on this specific enforcement action, Pat? I don't recall it being on any agenda. Pat's smile tightened. It was standard enforcement of existing regulations. Operational decisions don't require board votes. Eleanor leaned forward. Except when those decisions involve protected properties or require significant expenditures. Your bylaws, Section 4, Paragraph 7, specifically require board approval for enforcement actions exceeding $2,500. The bulldozer rental alone surpassed that threshold. The meeting continued for 3 hours, with neighbors rising to speak on both sides. Some complained about other heavy-handed enforcement actions they'd experienced. Others expressed concern about property values if exceptions were allowed. Throughout, Pat maintained that she had acted within her authority and for the good of the community. When the board finally called for a vote on how to proceed, the result was a narrow 4-3 decision to form a committee to investigate the matter further. A bureaucratic solution that resolved nothing immediately, but at least prevented Pat from taking any further action against my property. As people filed out, many stopped to examine the historical photographs I'd brought, their interest in the house's history seemingly genuine. A few even apologized for not speaking up sooner about Pat's tactics. "She's been ruling this neighborhood like a dictator for years," whispered Marion Collins, an elderly resident who'd lived there even longer than my grandmother. "About time someone stood up to her." Pat avoided me as she gathered her things, but I caught her venomous glare when she thought I wasn't looking. This small victory hadn't humbled her, it had only made her more determined. I would need to stay vigilant. As Eleanor, Dr. Chen, and I walked back to my house in the cool evening air, I felt both accomplished and apprehensive. "This is just the beginning," Eleanor warned, echoing my thoughts. "She's embarrassed and cornered. That makes her dangerous. We need to keep building community support while the legal process moves forward." Dr. Chin nodded in agreement. "I'll expedite the historical designation renewal and make sure all local authorities have the proper documentation. But Ms. Michaels is right. Administrative processes take time. Your best immediate protection is neighborhood awareness." That night, I sat on my porch swing, looking out at the damaged fence illuminated by streetlights. The iron fragments seemed to glow as if imbued with the significance of their history. I made a decision then. This wasn't just about defending my property rights anymore. It was about reclaiming the neighborhood from a petty tyrant who had forgotten that community means more than property values. I would need to become not just a defender, but a leader. Someone who could remind everyone why they'd chosen to live here in the first place. The irony wasn't lost on me that Pat had unwittingly awakened something she would soon regret. A historian who understood that the past could be a powerful weapon in shaping the future. In the weeks following the board meeting, I channeled my academic expertise into community action, creating the Oak Ridge Historian, a newsletter highlighting our neighborhood's rich historical significance. The first issue focused on my house's Civil War connections, but subsequent editions revealed surprising historical value in many neighborhood properties. From a craftsman bungalow designed by a Frank Lloyd Wright protege to a carriage house that served as an underground railroad stop, with each story neighbors began seeing our community not as properties to be standardized, but as a living museum with American history embedded in its architecture. Pat counterattacked with predictable aggression, first sending cease-and-desist letters claiming my newsletter violated solicitation rules, then launching her own publication, Oak Ridge Standards, which warned about how historical designation reduces property values by limiting modernization. She organized surprise beautification assessments targeting my supporters and spread alarming rumors that I planned to commercialize my home as a tourist attraction, that government officials would gain unrestricted access to properties, that everyone's taxes would skyrocket. The community polarized between team history and team property value, with debates erupting at neighborhood gatherings and school meetings. I found unexpected allies. Frank Delgado discovered his colonial home had Revolutionary War connections. My university provided research resources, and even the mayor expressed support for preservation. But Pat marshaled her own forces, particularly among newer residents who viewed their homes purely as investments. She expertly manipulated their fears about resale value, building a well-funded opposition bloc. Our conflict culminated at the annual Founders' Day picnic, where we set up competing booths, mine displaying historical artifacts, hers offering glossy brochures with charts showing how non-standard exteriors supposedly decreased property values by 15%. When we inevitably confronted each other, Pat's professional veneer cracked slightly. "You're destroying what makes this neighborhood desirable," she hissed while maintaining her public smile. "People move here for prestige and appreciation, not history lessons." I countered with research about the heritage premium that historically preserved communities command in real estate markets. "This isn't about architectural preferences," she snapped, revealing unexpected emotion. "It's about control. I've built this community and I won't let your elitist preservation crusade destroy it." Her vehemence suggested something deeper than HOA politics, a personal stake I couldn't yet identify. My grandmother's wisdom echoed in my mind. When someone fights too hard against something reasonable, look for what they're really protecting. Meanwhile, the legal process advanced methodically. Eleanor filed our lawsuit seeking damages and an injunction against further HOA interference. Dr. Chen documented the historical significance of both house and fence, while Pat filed motions arguing that HOA covenants superseded historical considerations. The case grew complex enough that the judge ordered mediation, forcing Pat and me to seek common ground. "This gives us a chance to avoid years of litigation," Eleanor explained, "but requires compromise. Are you prepared for that?" I wasn't sure. Beyond rebuilding my fence lay a principle that felt too important to compromise: a community's right to preserve its character against corporate standardization. The county historical archives were housed in a basement room that smelled of old paper and dust, a scent I normally found comforting in my academic pursuits, but now barely noticed as I focused on the task at hand. After weeks of public battle with Pat, I had decided to research her connection to the neighborhood. Understanding one's opponent is basic strategy, and something about her passionate opposition to historical preservation felt personal. With Martha Jenkins' help, I had traced Pat's history in Oak Ridge Estates back 15 years, shortly after which she had been elected to the HOA board and begun her rise to president. Before that, records showed she had lived in 3 other upscale communities across the state, never staying longer than 5 years. Curious pattern for someone so concerned about neighborhood stability, Martha observed, adjusting her glasses as she examined the property records. It was in the 3rd box of community board minutes that I found the first clue, a name in the margins of a planning document from 20 years ago, Richardson Development Group. Further digging revealed that before becoming the formidable HOA president, Patricia Richardson had been Patricia Richardson Whitmore, co-owner of a development company specializing in community rejuvenation, a euphemism, it seemed, for buying historic properties, demolishing them, and constructing luxury homes in their place. News clippings chronicled protests against her company's projects in Burlington, where an 1,850 Milltown had been partially razed for condominiums, and in Millfield, where a historic black church had mysteriously burned down after the congregation refused to sell. No criminal charges had ever been filed, but the pattern was disturbing. Most interesting was the company's sudden dissolution 12 years ago, shortly after Pat had moved to Oak Ridge Estates under her maiden name, apparently reinventing herself as a concerned homeowner rather than a developer. The final piece clicked into place when I discovered a rejected proposal from Richardson Development to the previous Oak Ridge Estates HOA board, a plan to revitalize the neighborhood by replacing its oldest homes with luxury townhouses. The proposal had been submitted just months before Pat joined the community and began her campaign for the HOA board. She's been playing the long game, I realized, spreading the documents across the archive table, get elected, change the regulations to make historic homes non-compliant, pressure owners to sell or pay for expensive modifications, and eventually transform the entire neighborhood. It was breathtakingly cynical, and explained her particular hostility toward my efforts to reinforce historical protections. If my campaign succeeded, it would permanently derail the plan she had been methodically advancing for over a decade. Armed with this knowledge, I faced a dilemma. Using Pat's past against her felt like descending to her level of personal attacks, but the stakes were larger than our individual conflict. The entire character of the neighborhood hung in the balance. After consulting with Eleanor, who reminded me that truth is an absolute defense against claims of defamation, I decided to proceed carefully. Rather than launching public accusations, I would present the information at the upcoming mediation session, where legal privileges would protect against defamation claims. But fate had other plans. The night before our scheduled mediation, my phone rang. It was Frank Delgado, his voice tight with urgency. "There's an emergency board meeting happening right now," he said. "Pat called it without notifying me or the other members who voted against her last time. They're pushing through approval for enforcement actions against 8 more non-compliant properties, all historical homes, including yours again." I arrived at the clubhouse to find the meeting already in progress, Pat standing at the front of the room with a PowerPoint presentation showing neighborhood eyesores that required immediate action. She faltered mid-sentence when I entered, flanked by Eleanor, Dr. Chen, and several homeowners I'd called en route. "This meeting wasn't publicly noticed as required by HOA bylaws," Eleanor announced, her voice cutting through the room. "Any actions taken tonight are procedurally invalid." Pat recovered quickly, her professional smile firmly in place. "This is a working session, not a formal meeting. No binding votes are being taken." But the hastily hidden agenda on the projector screen told a different story, with vote approval of enforcement actions clearly visible. "Then you won't mind if we observe this working session," I said, taking a seat directly in Pat's line of sight. The tension in the room was palpable as Pat attempted to continue her presentation, now carefully avoiding any mention of votes or approvals. When she finally opened the floor for discussion, I approached the podium with my folder of research findings. "Before we discuss these alleged violations, I think the community deserves to know the true motivation behind them." Pat's expression hardened as I began methodically presenting the documents I'd discovered, her development company's history, the pattern of historic demolitions, the rejected proposal, and finally, her strategic move to become an enforcement authority over the very properties her company had once sought to acquire. With each revelation, the room grew more still, homeowners exchanging shocked glances as they realized the extent of the deception. When I finished, Pat stood, her composure finally cracking. "This is a disgraceful personal attack with no relevance to HOA's business," she snapped. "My previous business ventures have nothing to do with current enforcement priorities." Frank Delgado rose from his seat at the board table. "I think they have everything to do with it, Pat. You've been systematically targeting historic properties with technical violations while ignoring similar issues on newer homes. The pattern is clear now. Other board members began distancing themselves, physically and verbally, from Pat's position. Charles Wilson, a retired attorney who had generally supported Pat's initiatives, cleared his throat uncomfortably. I believe we should adjourn this meeting and reconsider the enforcement priorities at our next properly noticed session. As the meeting disbanded in disarray, Pat cornered me near the exit, her voice low and venomous. You've made a serious mistake. This community needs progress, not preservation, and most homeowners care more about their property values than your precious history. There was desperation beneath her anger now, the desperation of someone whose carefully constructed facade was crumbling. The developers I work with now will still win in the end. They always do. It was the closest thing to a confession I could have hoped for, an admission that she was still connected to development interests, despite her public persona as a concerned homeowner. As she stalked away, I felt not triumph but sadness at the realization that our neighborhood had been manipulated for years by someone who saw its character as an obstacle rather than a treasure. The revelation had stopped tonight's immediate threat, but the larger battle was far from over. Pat had built her power base carefully over many years, and despite this setback, she still had allies on the board and among homeowners worried about property values. The community remained divided, and until that changed, our historical heritage remained vulnerable. What we needed now was not just defense against Pat's schemes, but a positive vision that could unite the neighborhood around its unique character. As I drove home through streets lined with homes spanning a century of architectural evolution, I began formulating that vision, one that would preserve our past while securing our future. Pat responded to her public exposure with ruthless efficiency. An urgent community bulletin appeared on doorsteps overnight, warning about radical historical designation efforts threatening homeowner rights, complete with doctored images showing my house surrounded by tour buses and souvenir stands. The glossy mailer featured alarming headlines about property values at risk, fabricated expert quotes claiming historical designations could slash home prices by 30%, and a petition opposing excessive preservation measures that had already gathered significant signatures. It was calculated fear-mongering that played directly on homeowners' financial anxieties. The attacks soon turned personal. Anonymous phone calls questioned my qualifications and motives. False rumors circulated about my tax status and alleged connections to tourism developers. Pat even distributed embarrassing photos from my college days in a historical reenactment society, framing me as an extremist obsessed with living in the past. The Whisper campaign reached my university, with complaints to my department chair suggesting my community activism compromised my academic objectivity. Eleanor advised against direct responses to these provocations. She's trying to drag you into a mud fight to distract from the substantive issues, she explained. Don't take the bait. Instead of counterattacking, I shifted the narrative entirely. With student volunteers, I researched successful historical districts nationwide that had enhanced rather than diminished property values. We gathered data from Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans, and numerous smaller communities where preserved character had become an economic asset. This research formed the foundation for a community workshop I organized, Heritage as Value, Preservation and Prosperity in Historical Neighborhoods, featuring experts in heritage properties and representatives from successful preservation districts. The event drew nearly 100 residents, including several curious HOA board members. My presentation directly confronted Pat's false dichotomy. The choice between preservation and prosperity is a myth contradicted by market evidence, I explained, displaying data showing how preserved districts consistently outperformed redeveloped neighborhoods in long-term value appreciation. Historical authenticity creates irreplaceable value that mass-produced luxury cannot match. The most compelling testimony came from Sarah Jacobs, president of nearby Wellington Heights Neighborhood Association, who described their 47% property value increase over the past decade, outperforming all non-historical districts in the county, achieved through thoughtful preservation policies developed with community input. The workshop succeeded in changing the conversation. Board members who had supported Pat began considering alternatives to her divisive approach. Frank Delgado noted approvingly, "For weeks it's been property rights versus preservation. Now people are discussing how to have both." The event concluded with the formation of a citizen committee to develop heritage-conscious community standards, a direct challenge to the HOA's aesthetic authority. The breakthrough that would ultimately turn the tide came unexpectedly through Marion Collins, an elderly neighbor who had first encouraged me to stand up to Pat. She brought me a weathered envelope of documents her grandmother had entrusted to her. Photographs, newspaper clippings, and correspondence, revealing a neighborhood controversy from 15 years prior. The yellowed articles documented a failed attempt to designate several Oak Ridge properties as a historical district, an effort derailed by aggressive opposition from Richardson Development Group, Pat's former company. Most damning was a threatening letter on company letterhead signed by Pat herself, warning my grandmother that her preservation efforts constituted tortious interference with our business interests and threatening legal action. "Your grandmother stood firm," Marion explained softly. "She quietly pursued the National Registry listing for your house when the district designation failed." Pat never forgave her, or the others who sought similar protections. When Pat later moved in and ran for the HOA board, your grandmother recognized her intentions immediately but was already too ill to fight. This smoking gun proved Pat's vendetta had deep roots in thwarted development plans from years before, explaining her particular hostility toward my property and my preservation efforts. The documents illuminated everything: Pat's obsessive enforcement of regulations against historical homes, her resistance to preservation efforts, even her personal animosity toward me as my grandmother's heir. With Eleanor's guidance, I prepared to use this evidence at our upcoming mediation session, but I also wanted the community to understand the forces truly at work in our neighborhood. The next issue of my newsletter featured a carefully worded article about development interests and historical preservation in Oak Ridge Estates, outlining the previous conflict without directly accusing Pat of current misconduct. It included quotes from the Wellington Heights speakers about the economic benefits of preservation and invited residents to consider whether past development plans might still be influencing current community decisions. It walked the line of legal safety while planting important seeds of suspicion about Pat's motives. The county courthouse stood imposingly in the morning light, its limestone facade and classical columns a testament to an era when public buildings were designed to inspire civic pride rather than merely house bureaucracy. Our mediation session was scheduled for 9 a.m. in a wood-paneled conference room with Judge Harriet Simmons, a no-nonsense jurist with a reputation for cutting through legal posturing, presiding. Eleanor and I arrived early, arranging our documentation methodically on our side of the table. Pat arrived precisely on time, accompanied by not one but 3 attorneys from Weatherby & Stone, an aggressive firm known for representing development interests. Their appearance confirmed what I had long suspected. Pat wasn't fighting this battle alone or with HOA resources. She had powerful backers with financial interests in Oak Ridge Estate's future. Judge Simmons began by outlining the purpose of mediation: to find an agreeable resolution without the expense and acrimony of a trial, before asking each side to present their position. Pat's lead attorney, a silver-haired man with an expensive suit and practiced gravitas, spoke first. "This is a straightforward contractual matter," he asserted. "When Professor Thornton took ownership of the property, she explicitly agreed to abide by HOA covenants that govern exterior appearances. The fence in question violated multiple provisions of those covenants. The HOA, as properly constituted governing authority for the community, took necessary enforcement action after multiple notices went unanswered." He presented a folder of documentation, copies of the alleged notices, HOA bylaws, and photographs of my fence highlighting supposed violations. While the association regrets that Professor Thornton was unaware of the historical claims regarding her property, such claims don't override validly enacted covenants that she voluntarily accepted upon taking ownership. Eleanor's response was measured but forceful. This is not merely a contractual matter, but a conflict between private agreements and federal law, she began, distributing copies of the National Historic Preservation Act provisions that protected designated properties. The Thornton House was officially registered in 1979, with that designation properly recorded in county property records. Any HOA covenant that conflicts with federal protection is unenforceable as a matter of law. She presented Dr. Chen's official assessment documenting the historical significance of the fence and the damages caused by its destruction. Furthermore, we have evidence that the enforcement action was not properly authorized by the HOA board, as required by the association's own bylaws, making it procedurally invalid regardless of the historical designation issue. The legal arguments continued for nearly an hour, with technical points about covenant enforcement, historical designation procedures, and property law precedents. Throughout, Pat sat stiffly beside her attorneys, occasionally whispering instructions but otherwise maintaining a mask of professional detachment. Judge Simmons listened attentively, asking pointed questions of both sides that suggested she was well versed in the underlying legal issues. When the initial positions had been established, she directed us to address specific areas of potential compromise: restoration of the fence, modification of HOA regulations to acknowledge historically protected properties, and compensation for damages. It was during this more open discussion that Pat's composure finally cracked, when Eleanor suggested that the HOA should adopt explicit exemptions for properties with historical designation. Pat interjected sharply. That would create a two-tier system of property rights and open the door to unlimited exemptions that would destroy community standards. Judge Simmons raised an eyebrow at the emotional response. Ms. Richardson, the purpose of mediation is to find middle ground. If federal law indeed protects historically designated properties, then acknowledging that reality in HOA regulations would seem a reasonable accommodation. Pat's attorney placed a cautionary hand on her arm, but she shook it off. "This isn't about one fence," she insisted, her voice tight with suppressed anger. "It's about maintaining the character and value of a premium neighborhood. If we allow exceptions for subjective historical claims, soon everyone will have an excuse to ignore standards. Property values will plummet as the neighborhood loses its cohesive aesthetic." The mask had slipped, revealing the developer's mindset beneath the homeowner advocate facade. Aesthetic cohesion was developer speak for the kind of standardization that made properties easier to market and sell. It was time to play my final card. "Your Honor," I said, opening the manila envelope Marion had provided, "I believe the context of this dispute may be relevant to finding an appropriate resolution." I distributed copies of the documentation showing Pat's previous development interests in Oak Ridge Estates, including the threatening letter to my grandmother. "This is not merely a disagreement about HOA regulations. Ms. Richardson has a long-standing opposition to historical preservation in our neighborhood, stemming from her previous role as a developer seeking to acquire and replace its oldest homes." Pat's face flushed with anger as she saw the documents, her attorneys whispering urgently beside her. "This is irrelevant ancient history," her lead counsel objected. "Ms. Richardson's previous business activities have no bearing on current HOA enforcement actions." Judge Simmons examined the documents carefully. "I'll determine what's relevant to finding an equitable resolution," she stated firmly, "and understanding the full context of this conflict seems quite relevant indeed." She studied the threatening letter with particular attention. "Ms. Richardson, were you continuing to pursue development interests in Oak Ridge Estates while serving as HOA president?" Pat's attorney attempted to intervene, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. "I'd like to hear directly from Ms. Richardson." Put on the spot, Pat faltered. "I maintain connections within the development community, as many real estate professionals do, but my HOA service has been solely about protecting property values." It wasn't a direct answer, and Judge Simmons noted the evasion. "I see. And these connections wouldn't influence your enforcement priorities as HOA president?" The mediation session extended well into the afternoon, with Judge Simmons skillfully keeping the focus on finding a resolution despite the increasingly evident personal animosity. By late afternoon, exhaustion and legal reality had worn down Pat's resistance. The final agreement, which Judge Simmons would formalize in a court order, included several key provisions. My fence would be restored using historically accurate materials and craftsmanship, with costs covered by the HOA's insurance. The HOA would adopt new regulations explicitly recognizing the protected status of historically designated properties. A committee of homeowners and preservation experts would develop guidelines for maintaining historical features while addressing legitimate community concerns, and most importantly, all enforcement actions against properties with potential historical significance would require full board approval and consultation with preservation authorities. Pat signed the agreement with poorly concealed fury, refusing to meet my eyes across the table. As we gathered our materials to leave, Judge Simmons offered a final observation. "Communities thrive when they balance respect for the past with adaptation to the present," she noted. "Neither absolute preservation nor unrestricted development serves the common good. I hope this resolution helps Oak Ridge Estates find that balance." It was diplomatic wisdom that acknowledged both perspectives, though I suspected Pat saw it as judicial bias toward preservation. As we left the courthouse, Pat's lead attorney pulled her toward their waiting town car, whispering intently, "Damage control, already beginning for whatever development interests had been backing her crusade." Eleanor was jubilant as we walked to her car. "This is better than we could have achieved at trial," she explained. "The judge essentially forced the HOA to create a preservation-conscious regulatory framework, which will protect not just your property but potentially dozens of others." She squeezed my arm encouragingly. "Your grandmother would be proud." I felt satisfaction but also weariness. The months of conflict had taken their toll in stress and damaged relationships within the community. The legal victory was important, but rebuilding neighborhood cohesion would be a longer, more subtle challenge. As we drove back toward Oak Ridge Estates, I contemplated my next steps. The fence would be restored, the legal battle won, but the deeper work of helping my neighbors reconnect with their community's history and with each other was just beginning. The restoration of my fence became a community event. Though the court order required the HOA to fund the work, I organized a restoration day where neighbors could observe the process and learn about historical ironwork from the master craftsmen hired for the project. Children took rubbings of the original fence fragments while adults examined photographs of the neighborhood from various eras. Even some of Pat's staunchest supporters attended, curiosity overcoming lingering resentment. The atmosphere was festive, with local restaurants donating refreshments and the university's history department providing informational displays about architectural preservation. "This is what community really means," Frank Delgado commented as we watched a craftsman demonstrate traditional forging techniques. "Not enforcing conformity, but celebrating what makes our neighborhood unique." Pat herself was notably absent, though rumors circulated about her future. Some said she was quietly marketing her house, others claimed she was consulting with developers about properties in other historical neighborhoods. The HOA board, now led by Frank following Pat's resignation, had begun the process of revising regulations to balance preservation with practical homeowner needs. The Citizens Committee, created by our settlement agreement, met weekly, developing nuanced guidelines that recognized both historical value and modern living requirements. "It's not about freezing everything in amber," Frank explained at a community meeting. "It's about thoughtful evolution that respects the character that drew us all here in the first place." My personal vindication came in unexpected forms. The university approved my proposal for a community history project documenting Oak Ridge Estates' architectural evolution, providing student assistance and research resources. Local media covered the fence restoration as a human interest story, expanding to explore the neighborhood's historical significance. Most surprisingly, the State Historical Society approached me about featuring the Thornton House in their annual tour of significant properties. a prestigious recognition that even skeptical neighbors acknowledged would enhance the community's reputation and, yes, property values. The house that Pat had dismissed as an eyesore was becoming a point of community pride. The final confirmation of our victory came on a crisp autumn morning 3 months after the court settlement. I was grading papers on my freshly restored porch when a sleek black Lexus pulled up across the street. A man in an expensive suit emerged, taking photographs of several houses with his phone. Curious, I approached him, introducing myself as a resident. "Beautiful neighborhood," he commented appreciatively. "So much character compared to the new developments sprouting up everywhere." When I asked his interest, he handed me a business card. "Martin Weatherby, Weatherby Development Group. We had been considering a major acquisition and redevelopment project here," he explained, oblivious to my connection to the recent conflict, working with a local partner who thought the area was ripe for luxury modernization. He gestured toward the historical homes lining the street. "But the recent preservation framework makes the economics challenging. Can't just bulldoze and build cookie-cutter luxury homes when there's historical designation involved." He shrugged philosophically. "Probably for the best. These craftsmanship details would be impossible to replicate today anyway." As he drove away, I felt a profound sense of closure. Pat's grand scheme, years in the making, had been thwarted not just by my stubborn defense of one fence, but by a community's rediscovery of its historical identity. The developer confirmed what we had argued all along. Our neighborhood's character was not a liability, but an irreplaceable asset that increased rather than diminished its value. That evening, I hosted the first official meeting of the Oak Ridge Historical Society in my living room. 20 neighbors, including former opponents from the HOA conflict, gathered to discuss future preservation initiatives and community education efforts. As we shared wine and conversation, Marion Collins raised her glass in a toast. "To Jamie's grandmother," she said warmly, "who knew that some battles are worth fighting even when victory might come after you're gone." The following weekend, we held our first neighborhood heritage tour, with homeowners proudly showcasing their property's historical features to visitors from across the region. My house, with its newly restored fence gleaming in the sunlight, was the centerpiece, its Civil War history and architectural significance now properly documented and celebrated. As I guided visitors through the property, explaining its connection to reconciliation efforts after the nation's most divisive conflict, I couldn't help but see parallels to our community's recent healing. "This house has always been about bringing people together," I told my attentive audience. "Even when forces of division seem overwhelming, preservation of our shared heritage provides common ground." Pat Richardson sold her house quietly and moved away, her development aspirations for Oak Ridge Estates permanently blocked by our new preservation framework. I occasionally think about her, not with anger but with a kind of sadness for someone who could look at beautiful historical homes and see only profit potential in their replacement. Her short-sightedness had nearly cost our community its soul, but in fighting her, we had ultimately strengthened that soul. The neighborhood continues to evolve, with thoughtful renovations that respect historical character while accommodating modern needs. Property values have indeed risen, not despite our historical character, but because of it, as buyers specifically seek the unique charm and community pride that defines Oak Ridge Estates. My fence stands as a daily reminder that some things are worth fighting for, even when the battle seems impossibly uneven. Its intricate ironwork, with symbols of national reunification hidden in the patterns, feels especially meaningful now, after our own community's reconciliation. I often sit on my porch in the evenings, watching neighbors stroll past, stopping to admire the craftsmanship or chat about upcoming historical society events. Children who once played oblivious to their surroundings now point out architectural details to their parents, their young minds awaken to the stories embedded in the buildings around them. The quiet professor who inherited a house has become a community leader, a role I never anticipated but have come to cherish. Sometimes visitors ask if I'm concerned about another Pat Richardson emerging to threaten our historical character once again. I always give the same answer. History isn't just about preservation, it's about learning from the past. And I think we've all learned that our heritage is too valuable to take for granted. The real victory wasn't just in the courthouse or the restored fence, but in the community's awakened appreciation for its own unique character. Pat never understood that true value isn't measured in standardized luxury, but in the irreplaceable authenticity that comes from honoring our shared past while building our common future. As for what comes next for Oak Ridge Estates and its newly energized citizens, well, I'm a historian, not a fortune teller, but I'd say the past and future have rarely looked so promising together. If you've enjoyed this story of historical preservation and community activism, don't forget to subscribe for more tales of everyday justice and unexpected heritage discoveries across America.